The first meeting was not planned by the parents. It began with the boys, who had agreed after the debate competition that they could no longer carry the truth alone. A week later, on a grey Saturday afternoon, they met in a quiet park on the edge of the city. The air smelled of damp earth, the trees still bare from winter, their branches like fingers clawing at the cloudy sky. They sat on a worn bench, their shoulders tense, their voices hushed though no one else was near. Alexei was the first to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush. I told my mother part of it, about the blood test, about how things don't add up. He clenched his fists. She cried, Dmitry. She didn't deny it, but she didn't admit it either. She just cried. Dmitry stared at the ground, his breath fogging in the cold air. I confronted mine too. My mother lied, but I could see it in her eyes. She knows something. He hesitated, then looked up. If this is real, if we were switched, what do we do? For a long time, they sat in silence, the enormity of their discovery pressing down on them. Finally, Alexei said, we have to make them talk. Both families. Together. The idea hung in the air like a dare. It was reckless, terrifying, but necessary. The following week, under the weight of their insistence, the impossible happened. The families agreed to meet. Marina resisted at first, her pride rising in sharp protest, but Dmitry's quiet desperation wore her down. Anna, trembling with dread, finally confessed to Pavel that the truth could no longer be hidden. And so a time and place were chosen, a small community hall near the hospital where both boys had been born. The hall was simple, its walls lined with peeling paint, the smell of dust and old wood heavy in the air. A single long table stood in the center. The boys sat side by side at one end, while their parents faced each other across the wood like combatants before a duel. Marina arrived in a tailored coat, her posture stiff, her expression icy. Sergei loomed beside her, broad-shouldered, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Across from them sat Anna and Pavel, their clothes plain, their faces etched with exhaustion but softened by love. The contrast between the families was stark, almost cruel. For a moment no one spoke. The ticking of a clock on the wall seemed thunderous in the silence. Finally Anna's voice broke through, fragile but steady. There may have been a mistake, she whispered. The night the boys were born. Marina's lips curled in disbelief. You think you can walk in here and claim? It isn't a claim, Dmitry interrupted, his voice shaking but firm. It's the truth. Our blood types don't match. The records don't match. You've known it. Both of you. He looked at Marina, then Sergei. Haven't you? Marina's face paled, her mask of elegance cracking. Sergei's jaw tightened, his silence more damning than words. Across the table, Anna clutched Pavel's hand, tears brimming in her eyes. The boys exchanged a glance, fear, anger, relief all tangled together. Finally Pavel spoke, his voice low but steady. We need proof. A DNA test. Nothing else will settle this. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Marina's chin lifted as if to protest, but Sergei laid a hand on her arm, his eyes dark and calculating. Fine, he said. Let the science decide. And with that, the course of their lives was sealed. The families left the hall in silence, each retreating into their own storm of emotions. The boys walked side by side into the fading light, the weight of what was coming pressing on their young shoulders. Neither spoke, for there was nothing left to say. The truth, long buried, was about to be unearthed completely, and none of them would emerge unchanged. The days that followed the meeting stretched unbearably long. Each family moved through time as if caught in thick fog, every hour heavy with unspoken dread. For the boys, school became meaningless. Lessons blurred, conversations passed unheard, and all that mattered was the waiting or anticipation of an answer that could shatter everything they had ever known. The DNA samples had been taken in a sterile clinic, the white walls and humming fluorescent lights pressing down on them like a cage. A nurse swabbed the insides of their cheeks, sealed the vials, and promised results in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It felt like a lifetime. For Dmitry, the wait was suffocating. His father grew more silent than ever, spending evenings locked in his study, while his mother oscillated between icy composure and sudden bursts of sharpness. Dmitry wandered the apartment like a ghost, his thoughts circling endlessly. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining both outcomes, one where nothing changed, another where everything did. Neither seemed bearable. Alexei's home was different but no less tense. Anna clung to him, holding his hand at every chance, her eyes red from crying. Pavel tried to stay strong, but his silence betrayed him. Alexei spent long hours outside, kicking a ball against the wall until his legs ached, trying to run away from the gnawing uncertainty. Yet wherever he went, the same thought followed. What if they weren't my parents at all? The boys met in secret during those weeks, their conversations brief but weighted. They walked along the river, its surface breaking apart with floating chunks of ice, the water rushing fast beneath. Sometimes they spoke of ordinary things: school, friends, the weather, but always the silence afterward carried the same unspoken fear. Finally, the day arrived. The clinic's waiting room was crowded, its chairs lined with restless patients, but for the two families the world had narrowed to a single point. Marina sat rigid, her gloves clutched tightly in her lap. Sergei stared at the floor, his expression unreadable. Across from them, Anna twisted her scarf nervously while Pavel's jaw worked silently, his hand resting protectively on Alexei's shoulder. The boys sat side by side, their knees almost touching, though neither dared to meet the other's eyes. When the doctor entered, a thick envelope in his hands, the air seemed to vanish from the room. He cleared his throat, his voice professional, steady. The results are conclusive. There was a mistake the night these boys were born. Dmitry Sergeyevich is the biological son of Anna and Pavel Petrov. Alexei Pavlovich is the biological son of Sergei and Marina Volkov. The words fell like stones into a deep well, echoing, sinking, impossible to retrieve. Anna let out a sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Pavel closed his eyes, his face contorting with a mixture of grief and fury. Marina sat frozen, her pale face a mask of horror, while Sergei's fists clenched against his knees, his breath sharp through his teeth. The boys looked at each other at last, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the same question. What now? The doctor spoke again, but his words blurred into background noise, something about records, legal processes, counseling. None of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was the shattering of the world they had known. Anna reached for Dmitry instinctively, her voice breaking. "My son," she stopped, her hand trembling before it touched him, unsure if she had the right. Dmitry flinched, torn between the woman who had raised him in cold halls and the one who looked at him with desperate love. Alexei turned toward Marina, but she avoided his gaze, her pride warring with the truth. Sergei finally spoke, his voice low, heavy. "We'll need time," as if time could mend what had been broken. The families left the clinic in silence, each retreating to their separate corners of the city. The boys parted with a brief glance, their eyes carrying a storm of emotions: fear, sorrow, anger, confusion. They had the answer now, but no peace. For truth, once revealed, does not heal instantly. It tears open wounds first, leaving them raw and bleeding before any healing can begin. And so the real struggle began, not in discovering who they were, but in learning how to live with it. The city carried on with its usual rhythm. Markets bustled, trams screeched along their rails. Children shouted in the courtyards, but for the two families, time had changed. Days moved heavily, as though dragging chains, and each moment was colored by the revelation that refused to fade. For Dmitry, home had become unbearable. His father tried to ignore the truth, burying it beneath stricter routines and endless expectations, as if discipline could erase blood. "You are still my son," Sergei said more than once, though his voice was less conviction than command. Marina avoided Dmitry's eyes altogether, her pride too brittle to face what had been exposed. The apartment, once cold but predictable, now felt like a stage where everyone pretended not to notice the cracks in the walls. Dmitry walked its polished halls like a stranger. Alexei's home, though warmer, was no less shaken. Anna hovered over him constantly, her love fierce but edged with fear. Pavel grew short-tempered, not at Alexei himself, but at the injustice of it all. "They took him from us," he muttered late at night, pacing the small kitchen, his fists clenching. "They lived with our son while we struggled. They gave him everything money could buy while we..." His words trailed into silence, heavy with bitterness. Alexei listened from his room, guilt pressing on him even though none of it was his fault. The boys met often in secret, drawn together by the only person who could understand. They walked the city streets until late, their conversations circling the same questions again and again. "What do we do now?" Dmitry asked one evening as they sat on the riverbank, the water black beneath the streetlights. "I don't belong there, but I don't know if I belong here either." Alexei threw a stone into the river, watching the ripples spread. "Same for me." I love my parents, they're my parents, no matter what the blood says. But every time I look at them now, I wonder. Every time I see you, I wonder even more." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like we don't belong anywhere." Their words carried the weight of truth. They had been torn from the roots of their childhoods and thrust into a place where identity blurred, where love and biology pulled in opposite directions. The parents, too, could not avoid conflict. Marina and Sergei demanded meetings, speaking of rights, of legal recognition, of reclaiming the boy who was theirs by blood. Anna and Pavel resisted fiercely, refusing to let go of the son they had raised with every scrap of love they possessed. Voices rose in anger, tears were shed, threats whispered. The boys were rarely present, but they felt the tremors in every word, every glance. One evening, after another argument had ended in slammed doors and silence, Dmitry sat in his room staring at a family portrait on the wall. He no longer saw himself in it. The faces around him were pale, fair, distant, while his own seemed like an intruder. He rose suddenly, tore the frame from the wall, and shoved it into the back of his closet. In the small apartment across the city, Alexei faced a different pain. He overheard his father muttering angrily to Anna, "What if they take him from us? What if the courts decide he belongs to them?" Anna sobbed, clutching Pavel's arm, while Alexei stood frozen in the hallway, his heart twisting. The fear of losing the only family he had ever known pressed down on him like a weight he could not bear. The boys met again the next day, more desperate than before. "We have to do something," Alexei said, "before they tear us apart." "Like what?" Dmitry asked, his voice hollow. Alexei looked at him, his eyes burning with determination. "We choose. We decide who we are. Not them. Not the law. Not the past. Us." The idea sounded reckless, impossible, yet something in Dmitry stirred at the words. For the first time since the truth had come out, he felt a spark of control. But choices like that could not be made easily. They would come with consequences neither boy was ready to face. The storm between the families grew louder with each passing day, and soon the boys would find themselves forced to step into the center of it. Whether they wished to or not, the meeting was supposed to become a discussion arranged by Sergei in his usual commanding tone. But calm was impossible now. The two families gathered in a lawyer's office, neutral ground, though the air felt anything but neutral. The blinds were half drawn, the hum of traffic outside muted, and on the table lay a stack of documents that might as well have been weapons. Marina sat upright, her gloved hands folded neatly, her chin lifted high as if daring anyone to challenge her. Sergei leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, radiating authority. Across from them, Anna's fingers twisted in her lap, her eyes already brimming with unshed tears, while Pavel's fists rested heavily on the table, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. The boys sat together in the corner, watching as if trapped in a nightmare. "We cannot continue this charade," Sergei began, his voice low but hard as stone. "The DNA results are clear. Alexei belongs with us. Dmitry belongs with you. The switch must be corrected. Belongs." Pavel's voice cracked like a whip. He leaned forward, his face flushed. "He is not an object to be passed around. Alexei is our son. We raised him, loved him, fed him when we had nothing. You think you can walk in after 15 years and just take him?" Anna clutched his arm, whispering, Posha, but her own voice trembled with fury. Marina's lips curved in a thin smile. "Blood matters, Mr. Petrov. You cannot deny heritage. Our son has been deprived of his rightful life. That cannot continue. Our son." Anna's voice rose suddenly, sharp with pain. She pointed to Dmitry, who sat frozen in his chair. "That boy is ours by blood. But did you raise him with love? Did you hold him when he cried, sing to him when he was small? No, you buried him in silence and expectations. Don't speak to me of heritage when you don't understand what family means." The room erupted then. Voices clashed. Accusations flew. The lawyer tried and failed to calm them. The boys sat rigid, their hearts pounding. Dmitry's hands clenched into fists, his throat tight as he fought back the scream building inside him. Alexei stared at the table, his vision blurring with anger and shame. Finally, Dmitry stood, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stop it." The room fell into startled silence. He looked at both sets of parents, his chest heaving. "Do you hear yourselves? You're fighting over us like we're possessions, trophies to prove something. But we're not. We're people. We're your sons, yes, but we're also each other's brothers, whether you like it or not. Alexei rose too, his voice shaking but strong. You made a mistake 15 years ago, and now you want us to pay for it. Well, we won't. You can fight all you want, but we're the ones who have to live with this, not you, us. The parents stared at them, stunned into silence. For a long moment, only the ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Then Sergei's voice, quieter now, broke the stillness. This isn't simple. Choices must be made. No, Dmitry said firmly. Not by you, by us. He and Alexei exchanged a glance, a silent pact forming in their eyes. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The meeting ended without resolution, only more bitterness. But as the families left the office, the boys lingered behind, stepping into the hallway together. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust, but to them, it was the air of freedom. Did you mean it? Alexei asked softly. About us being brothers. Dmitry looked at him, his eyes dark but steady. It never meant anything more. And with that, something shifted between them. The truth had torn their lives apart, but it had also bound them together. From that day forward, the fight was no longer just about where they belonged. It was about who they chose to become. The quarrels did not stop after the meeting. If anything, they grew louder, sharper, carried home, and echoed through every hallway of both apartments. Dmitry heard his father's booming voice late into the night, words like custody, heritage, responsibility slashing through the walls. Alexei heard his parents arguing too, softer but no less painful, Anna's sobs, Pavel's muttered curses, the creak of the old kitchen chair as he paced in circles. The boys felt trapped between two storms, and neither offered shelter. One evening, Dmitry slipped out of his building and walked across the city until he found Alexei waiting by the river. The sky was bruised with purple and gold, the water restless beneath the bridges. They sat on the edge of the embankment, their shoes inches from the rushing current. I can't take it anymore, Dmitry said at last, his voice hoarse. Every day it's the same shouting, decisions, papers. They look at me like I'm not even real, like I'm something to prove, not someone to love. Alexei nodded slowly. Same here. They're terrified they'll lose me, so they hold on tighter. But the more they do, the less I can breathe. He picked up a stone and hurled it into the water, watching the ripples spread. I don't want to be fought over like a dog's bone. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the rush of the river. Then Dmitry said quietly, what if we just left? For a while. To make them see we're not toys. To show them we can choose for ourselves. Alexei's eyes flickered with something between fear and excitement. Leave where? Anywhere. Just for a few days. Long enough to make them stop fighting and start listening. Dmitry's voice gained strength as he spoke, as if the idea had already begun to solidify in his mind. We don't belong to one family or the other, we belong to ourselves. If they can't understand that, then maybe this is the only way. Alexei hesitated, his pulse quickening. He thought of his mother's tears, his father's anger, the heavy silence of Dmitry's apartment. Then he met Dmitry's gaze and nodded. All right. Well, do it. Together. They began to plan in whispers, sketching possibilities like conspirators. Alexei could take money he had been saving for new shoes. Dmitry knew of an abandoned dacha his family once owned outside the city, a place no one visited anymore. It was quiet, hidden among birch trees near a riverbank. Perfect for disappearing. For the first time in weeks, they felt something close to freedom. The thought of escape lightened their steps as they walked home that night, their pact sealed not with handshakes or promises, but with the fierce certainty in their eyes. Of course, they knew it would be dangerous. They knew their parents would panic, the police might get involved, the city might search. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was reclaiming their voices, their choices. As Dmitry slipped back into his silent apartment, and Alexei into his cramped but warm home, both felt the same rush of anticipation. For once, the next move would be theirs, not their parents'. The storm was about to break in a new way. And this time, the boys themselves would be at its center by choice, not by accident. The disappearance was discovered almost at the same hour, though in very different homes. In the Volkov apartment, Marina entered Dmitry's room at dawn, expecting to find him neatly dressed for his Saturday tutoring. The bed was unmade, the curtains still drawn, and the silence unusually deep. She frowned, annoyed more than alarmed, and called his name. No answer. She opened the wardrobe, the drawers. Some of his clothes were missing. His school bag lay abandoned, but the books had been removed. When she saw the empty space where money had been kept in Sergei's desk, her breath caught. "Sergei," she called, her voice sharp, trembling underneath. "He's gone." Across the city, Anna knocked on Alexei's door to wake him for breakfast. No reply. She opened it to find the bed empty, the sheets tangled, the window cracked open. Panic surged through her as her eyes swept the room. The soccer ball was missing, the wooden horse gone, his backpack nowhere in sight. She stumbled back into the kitchen, pale. "Pasha," she whispered. "He's not here." The calls began within the hour, first to friends, then to teachers, then to the police. The word missing struck like a hammer, echoing in every conversation. Officers arrived at both homes, their notepads ready, their questions sharp. What had they been wearing? Had they been fighting with anyone? Did they have money, contacts, places they might run? Anna sobbed as she tried to answer, her hands shaking. Pavel snapped at the officers, angry at their calm detachment. Marina, though outwardly composed, could not hide the tremor in her hands. Sergei barked orders into his phone, calling contacts in the police department, demanding immediate searches, patrols, checkpoints. By afternoon, the city seemed to know. Two boys, linked by a strange story, had vanished together. Whispers spread through neighborhoods, papers began to stir interest, and rumors flew faster than truth. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the boys woke to sunlight streaming through cracked shutters. For a moment, there was only silence and the soft creak of the docho around them. Then the reality struck. They had done it. They were free. They ate bread and jam for breakfast, laughing at the stickiness on their hands. They kicked the ball outside on the patchy grass, their voices carrying through the still air. For a few blissful hours, they forgot the weight of the world. But freedom had its shadows. By afternoon, Alexei noticed the food was already dwindling. Dmitri, unused to such practical concerns, suggested they walk to a nearby village for supplies. They wrapped themselves in jackets and set out along the dirt road, careful to avoid the main paths. What they did not know was that by then, patrol cars had already reached the outskirts of the forest. Flyers with their faces were being printed. Volunteers were gathering. The world was looking for them, and every hour brought the search closer. Back in the city, Anna clutched Alexei's pillow to her chest, her tears soaking the fabric. What if something happens to him, Pasha? What if we never see him again? Pavel stood at the window, staring into the grey streets, his fists tight. "We will find him. I swear it. Even if I have to tear this city apart." In the Volkov apartment, Marina sat silently in the living room, her face pale, her hands motionless on her knees. Sergei moved restlessly, issuing orders, making calls, but every now and then his gaze flicked to the empty hallway, his jaw tightening. The silence of the apartment, once a sign of control, now felt like a grave. The boys had wanted to escape the storm, but the storm had only grown louder. And soon, it would find them in the quiet refuge of the forest. The forest seemed endless, at first, a vast green sea that hid them from the world. The boys walked narrow paths under birch branches, their laughter bouncing between the trees. But by the second day, the forest began to change. The silence grew heavier, the shadows thicker, and with each step they felt the presence of something beyond their control. They had spent the night in the docho again, their bellies full only of bread and apples. By morning, the food was nearly gone. Alexei's stomach growled loudly, and he laughed it off, though worrying flickered in his eyes. Dmitri had never thought about survival before. Meals had always appeared, steaming on polished tables. Now he felt the gnaw of hunger and the weight of responsibility. "We need more supplies," Alexei said as he laced his boots. "The village isn't far. We can buy something." Dmitri nodded, clutching the bills he had taken from his father's desk. The money felt like fire in his pocket. They set off together, following a dirt road that wound through the trees until the roofs of wooden houses appeared in the distance. The village was small, its streets muddy from spring rains. Chickens scratched at the ground, and smoke rose from chimneys. The boys entered a small shop, its shelves lined with bread, canned goods, and jars of pickles. They bought what they could carry: bread, cheese, a few apples, avoiding the shopkeeper's curious gaze. But as they left, they heard whispers behind them. Two boys, alone, carrying backpacks, paying with crumpled notes. Their faces looked familiar, too familiar. By evening, a call reached the police station in the nearest town. "I think you've seen those boys you're looking for." That night, as they returned to the dacha, the boys sensed something had shifted. The forest no longer felt like shelter, but like a trap closing around them. Alexei kicked at the dirt, his voice low. "They'll come for us, won't they?" Dmitry didn't answer. He set down the food on the dusty table and sat heavily on the floor, his face pale. "Maybe that's what we wanted," he said finally. "For them to notice. For them to see we're not toys." Alexei dropped beside him, pulling at the threads of his worn backpack. "I just don't want to go back to the fighting. I don't want to see them tear each other apart because of us." The room fell quiet, the only sound the wind moaning against the shutters. Meanwhile, in the city, the search had become urgent. Posters with the boys' faces were plastered on walls and bus stops. Volunteers combed the parks and train stations. Police cars drove slowly through neighborhoods with flashing lights, loudspeakers calling their names. Anna joined the search, her scarf pulled tightly around her face, her eyes raw from sleepless nights. Pavel walked beside her, his steps heavy, his fury aimed at fate itself. "They're just boys," he muttered over and over, as if trying to convince the universe. Marina, for the first time in years, broke. She sat in her silent apartment, her gloves abandoned, her face buried in her hands. Sergei paced the room like a caged animal, his phone pressed constantly to his ear. But even his voice cracked when he barked orders. The empire of control he had built was crumbling, undone by the disappearance of one boy, his boy, though he had never truly shown it. By the third night, search parties reached the edge of the forest. Flashlights cut through the trees, dogs barked in the distance, and the dacha that had seemed so hidden was suddenly surrounded by unseen footsteps. Inside, the boys sat in the dark, listening. Alexei pressed his ear to the floorboards, his breath quick. "They're close." Dmitry felt his heart pound in his chest, every beat louder than the last. Freedom had been sweet, but now it trembled on the edge of vanishing. The night was alive with sound. The distant barking of dogs, the crunch of boots on fallen branches, the sweep of flashlight beams slicing through the forest. From the broken window of the dacha, Dmitry and Alexei watched the lights moving closer, weaving between the trees like restless stars. "They've found us," Alexei whispered, his breath trembling. Dmitry pressed his hand against the wall, as if steadying himself. "We knew this would happen. Do we just wait?" Alexei's voice cracked. "Let them drag us back so they can keep fighting." Silence filled the space between them, heavy as stone. The little house, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. Dmitry turned to his friend, his brother, though neither had spoken the word aloud yet Tan saw the same fear, the same fire, reflected in his eyes. "No," Dmitry said at last, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We run." They grabbed their bags, the bread half-eaten, the jar of jam sticky at the edges. Dmitry stuffed the flashlight into his pocket, Alexei clutched his wooden horse, and they slipped out the back door just as a dog barked sharply nearby. The forest swallowed them whole. Branches whipped their faces, roots caught at their feet, but they kept running, their lungs burning, their breath ragged clouds in the cold air. Behind them, voices shouted orders, barked, names called, but they did not stop. At last they stumbled into a clearing where the moonlight poured down like silver. They collapsed to their knees, gasping, listening. For a moment there was only silence, the thrum of their own blood in their ears. Then came the sound again, flashlights breaking through the trees, the search closing in. Alexei grabbed Dmitry's arm. "We can't outrun them forever." "Then we don't," Dmitry said, his eyes burning. "We decide how this ends. On our terms, not theirs." Alexei frowned, but before he could answer, the beams of light swept into the clearing. Shouts rang out. The boys stood together, shoulders squared, their hearts hammering as officers closed in from all sides. "Don't be afraid," Alexei whispered. "I'm not," Dmitry replied, though his knees trembled. "Not anymore." Within moments, strong hands gripped their arms, voices ordered them to stay still, and the chase was over. The boys were caught, but neither felt defeated. They had run not out of fear, but to prove something, that they were more than pawns in their parents' war. As they were led through the forest toward the waiting cars, their parents rushed forward. Anna broke free first, her arms wrapping Alexei in a desperate embrace, sobbing his name. Marina followed, her cry sharp as she reached for Dmitry, though he stiffened in her grasp. Pavel and Sergei hovered nearby, their faces pale, their eyes shadowed by guilt and fury. The boys, exhausted and trembling, exchanged one glance as the adults closed in around them. That glance said what words could not. We are not broken. Not yet. The search was over, but the real battle, the one for their future, was only beginning. The police cars hummed low as they rolled back into the city, headlights cutting through the mist of early dawn. Inside, the boys sat side by side in the back seat, their hands cuffed loosely, not because they were criminals, but because procedure demanded it. Neither spoke. Their breaths came slowly. Their clothes smelled of smoke and pine, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Yet beneath the silence burned something stronger than fear, a stubborn resolve. At the station, the cuffs were removed, and the families were allowed inside. The small waiting room became a battlefield. Anna rushed to Alexei first, pulling him into her arms so tightly he could hardly breathe. She kissed his hair, his face, whispering his name over and over, her tears wetting his cheek. Pavel stood close behind her, his large hand gripping Alexei's shoulder, his voice trembling as he muttered, "You're safe, thank God." Across the room, Marina clutched Dmitri, her manicured hands shaking, her composure shattered. For the first time, her pride was gone, stripped away by fear. "Don't you ever do that again," she cried, pressing her forehead to his. "Do you hear me? I thought I had lost you forever." Sergei hovered nearby, his jaw tight, his eyes darker than the storm outside. He said nothing, but his silence was heavier than words. Then the accusations began. "This is your fault." Marina snapped suddenly, her voice cutting through the room. She pointed at Anna and Pavel. "You poisoned their minds, you filled them with doubt, and now look what's happened. They could have died out there." Anna stiffened, her tears drying into anger. "Our fault. We raised them with love, while you smothered Dmitri with coldness and pride. Don't you dare blame us for your mistakes." Pavel stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. "Maybe if you had treated him like a son, he wouldn't have run." Sergei's eyes flashed, his voice like thunder. "Watch your words, Petrov. Dmitri is my son." The room trembled with their shouting, the air thick with fury and grief. The boys sat silent at first, their bodies tense, their hands gripping their knees. But as the storm of voices rose higher, something inside them snapped. Dmitri stood suddenly, his voice ringing clear. "Stop it." The room fell into stunned silence. His chest heaved as he looked from one pair of parents to the other. "Do you hear yourselves? You're still fighting, always fighting. But none of you ever ask us what we want. You talk about blood, about rights, about heritage, but you don't see us." Alexei rose beside him, his face pale but resolute. "He's right. We're not prizes. We're not proof of who's right or wrong. We're people. We're brothers, whether you accept it or not. And we'll decide together what happens to us." The word brothers hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. Marina gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Anna's tears returned, but this time they were silent, steady. Sergei and Pavel exchanged dark, unreadable looks, neither able to speak. For a long moment, the room was filled only with the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. The boys stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes blazing, their voices still echoing in the silence. Whatever came next, they had made their choice clear. They would no longer be spoken for. They would speak for themselves. The storm in the police station did not settle with words. The families left divided, their voices echoing down the corridors long after the boys had been escorted out. Yet the truth was undeniable now, and the law, once distant, stepped into the heart of their story. Within days, documents were filed. Lawyers spoke in cold tones about custody arrangements, guardianship rights, biological claims. A hearing was scheduled in the family court. It would no longer be a matter of shouting in kitchens or slamming doors in living rooms now. The fate of the boys would be decided beneath the heavy gaze of judges and law books. For Dmitri, the news felt like another prison. He sat in his grand apartment, staring at the polished table where his parents whispered fiercely about legal strategy. They spoke as though he were invisible, as though the most important piece in the puzzle had no voice of his own. He rose once, muttering, "You're talking about me, not with me." But they barely looked up. Marina reached for his arm, saying softly, "We're doing this for you." The words stung. Across the city, in the cramped warmth of the Petrov home, the atmosphere was no lighter. Anna held Alexei's hand whenever she could, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. Pavel paced the small kitchen, his voice hard with determination. We won't give him up. They can bring their lawyers, their money, their influence. He's our boy. Alexei listened, but the certainty in his father's words did not reach his heart. He loved them fiercely, yet he could not deny the bond that had grown between him and Dmitry. The boys found each other again in secret. They met behind the school, near the old fence where weeds grew tall, their breaths visible in the cool spring air. They're taking us to court, Dmitry said quietly. Alexei kicked at the dirt, his face tense, like we're criminals or property. They stood in silence, the weight of the world pressing on their shoulders. Then Alexei said, we have to stay together, no matter what they decide. Dmitry looked at him sharply. How? If the court says I belong with them and you belong with yours, then we fight it, Alexei interrupted. We tell them, in front of everyone. We're not giving them the choice this time. We'll make it ourselves. Dmitry felt a strange strength rise in him at those words. For so long he had been silent, obedient, a shadow in his own life. But standing beside Alexei, he felt something new, courage. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse was crowded. Journalists hovered outside, their cameras flashing, their pens ready to turn pain into headlines. Inside, the hall smelled of polished wood and ink, its high ceiling heavy with solemnity. The boys sat side by side at the long table, their parents flanking them on either side, tension crackling like fire. Anna's hands trembled as she prayed silently, Marina's lips pressed into a thin line, Sergei's stare hard as steel, Pavel's fists clenched. When the judge entered, all rose. His voice, calm but firm, filled the chamber. We are here to determine the future of two children whose lives were bound by a mistake 15 years ago. The proceedings began. Lawyers argued, papers were passed, voices rose and fell in practiced rhythms. But the boys heard none of it. They sat still, waiting, their pact echoing between them. We decide. When the judge finally asked if they wished to speak, the room held its breath. Dmitry rose first, his voice quiet but steady. I am not a piece of property. I am not a name on a paper. I am a person. Then Alexei stood beside him, his voice louder, firmer. We're brothers. That's the truth no test can change. And we will not be separated, no matter what anyone says. The words rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Parents gasped, lawyers exchanged glances, the judge's brows furrowed. The boys had taken the stand not as victims, not as pawns, but as a united voice. And for the first time, the question was no longer which family would win. It was, would anyone listen to the boys themselves? The courtroom had become a stage where every glance, every word carried the weight of lives. Outside, cameras flashed and journalists whispered, but inside the chamber the air was taut, thick with tension. The judge's gavel struck once, calling the room back to order after the boys' declaration. Thank you, the judge said, his voice slow and deliberate. The testimony of the children will be taken into account. But this case concerns not only what they feel, but the law, the future, and the responsibilities of those who raised them. And so the arguments continued. Lawyers spoke of rights and obligations, waving papers that seemed to reduce human lives to ink and signatures. Marina's counsel emphasized bloodlines, inheritance, and the importance of a boy growing within the legacy of his true family. Anna's lawyer countered with years of nurture, of sacrifice, of the irreplaceable bond forged by love. Through it all, Dmitry and Alexei sat side by side, their shoulders almost touching, their eyes fixed on the table before them. Each word spoken over their heads was like a hammer blow, but they endured it together. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge asked the nurse who had been on duty that fateful night 15 years ago to testify. She entered the room hesitantly, an older woman now, her eyes heavy with the weight of memory. Murmurs rippled through the audience. She spoke quietly, her voice trembling. It was my shift. The ward was crowded. Two women gave birth almost at the same time. I was new, overwhelmed. Her breath caught, her hands twisted together. I mixed up the tags. I realized too late. I wanted to confess, but I was terrified. So I said nothing. I watched the years pass and prayed it would never be discovered. But I knew, in my heart, the truth. Gasps filled the chamber. Marina stiffened, her face drained of color. Anna buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Sergei's jaw clenched as though carved from stone, while Pavel muttered a curse under his breath. The judge raised a hand for silence. Thank you. The truth must be spoken, however late. The boys looked at each other, their hearts racing. The mistake that had shaped their entire lives had finally been acknowledged aloud. Yet instead of relief, a deeper sorrow settled in. What had been stolen could never be returned. As the hearing continued, emotions boiled over. Marina stood suddenly, her voice sharp, her pride stripped bare. Do you see? It was fate. Our blood was meant to be together. Alexei belonged to us. Dmitri should have grown in our home. Anna rose too, trembling but fierce. Belongs. He is not an heirloom. He is a boy with a soul, with a life. You had your chance, Marina, and you smothered him with silence. Don't you dare say fate when it was neglect. The two women faced each other across the room, tears and fury burning in their eyes. The judge called for order, his gavel striking again and again, but their voices echoed long after they fell silent. Finally, it was Dmitri who broke the spell. He stood, his voice shaking but clear. Enough. No one can give us back the years we lost. No court can fix what was broken. But if you really love us, then listen, stop fighting. Stop tearing us apart. Alexei rose beside him, his eyes blazing. We don't need your war. We need your love. Both of you. All of you. We're not leaving each other. Not now, not ever. The room fell into stunned silence. The judge looked at them, his eyes thoughtful, his pen paused above the papers. The law had its rules, but here stood two boys who refused to be broken by it. The gavel struck once more. This court will recess. A decision will be rendered in due time. As the families filed out, the boys walked together down the long marble corridor. Reporters called their names, flashes lit the air, but they ignored it all. For the first time, they felt stronger than the storm around them. The truth was out, the fight raged on, but in their hearts one thing was unshakable. They had found each other, and that, more than any verdict, was their beginning. The courthouse steps were crowded with journalists, their cameras flashing like lightning, microphones thrust forward with questions sharp as knives. The families emerged under the glare, and instantly the storm broke loose. Mrs. Volkov, do you plan to reclaim your biological son? Mr. Petrov, how do you respond to the court testimony? Boys, what do you want for yourselves? The questions crashed one over another, hungry for answers, for headlines. Police officers tried to push the reporters back, but the chaos clung to the families like a swarm. Marina swept forward, chin lifted, her arm looped protectively around Dmitri as though she could claim him by force of posture alone. Sergei moved beside her, his expression like steel, his hand firm on Alexei's shoulder for a brief moment before Alexei wrenched himself free. The boy shot him a glare so sharp it silenced Sergei more effectively than words. Anna clung to Alexei, pressing him against her side, her eyes darting with fear at the crowd. Pavel shoved past reporters, shielding his family with broad shoulders, his voice booming. Back off. They're children, not your story. But to the crowd, they were story two boys switched at birth, their lives tangled in scandal. The police finally ushered them into separate cars, driving them away from the chaos. Yet even as the courthouse faded, the fury did not. At the Petrov apartment, Anna collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. I can't bear it, Pasha. They'll take him from us. They'll use their money, their power. Pavel slammed his fist on the table, the plates rattling. Over my dead body. He turned to Alexei, his voice softening. Don't you worry, son. No one's taking you anywhere. Alexei nodded, but inside he felt a twist of unease. He thought of Dmitri, walking back into the cold halls of that grand apartment, and something in him ached. Meanwhile, Marina paced her polished living room like a trapped animal. Did you hear her? Did you hear what she called me? A bad mother. After everything, Sergei interrupted, his voice cutting. Enough. The court will decide, not your emotions. But Marina spun toward him, her face pale with fury. And if the court sides with them, what then? Do we lose him forever? Sergei said nothing. His silence was more terrifying than anger. Upstairs, Dmitri sat in his room, staring at the city lights through the window. He felt the weight of both families pulling him apart, their voices tearing through his mind. Yet in the silence of his heart, one thought stood clear: Alexei. Later that night, the boys met again in secret. Dmitri slipped out of his apartment, his steps light against marble floors. Alexei left through the back stairwell of the old building, his breath sharp in the cool night. They found each other near the river, where the water shimmered with moonlight. For a while, they said nothing. Then Alexei spoke, his voice low. "What if the court decides against us? What if they split us apart?" Dmitry clenched his fists. "Then we don't let them. We've already run once, we can do it again." Alexei shook his head, staring at the water. "Running won't fix it. We need something stronger. A way to show them we're serious, that we've made our choice." Dmitry looked at him, the reflection of moonlight burning in his eyes. "And what is our choice?" Alexei turned, meeting his gaze. "To stay together. No matter where, no matter how. Brothers." The word hung in the night air, heavier and truer than any verdict. Both boys knew the road ahead would not be easy. The court, the parents, the world itself might try to divide them. But as the river whispered beneath the stars, they made a vow in silence, sealed not by law, but by the bond of their hearts. Whatever happened, they would face it side by side. The courthouse was quieter the second time, though the tension was sharper, tighter, as if every wall had learned to hold its breath. The first hearing had been spectacle, a storm of accusations and confessions. Now came the decision, and the air itself seemed to tremble under its weight. The boys arrived together, escorted by officers, their parents trailing like shadows. Dmitry wore a dark jacket that seemed too big for his thin frame, his face pale but steady. Alexei's clothes were simpler, his hair slightly unkempt, yet his eyes burned with defiance. They sat side by side at the long wooden table, their shoulders brushing, their silence louder than words. The judge entered, his robe sweeping the floor, his gaze grave. The room rose, then settled into stillness as he began to speak. "This case is unlike any other brought before this court. Two children, born the same night, switched by mistake, raised in families not their own by blood, yet loved and shaped in ways that law cannot measure. The question before us is not only legal, but human." He paused, scanning the room. Marina's lips were pressed into a thin line, her gloved hands trembling despite her rigid posture. Anna's eyes glistened, her fingers clutching Pavel's hand. Sergei sat motionless, his face carved from stone, while Pavel's chest rose and fell with restrained fury. The judge continued, his voice deliberate. "Arguments have been made for blood, for nurture, for rights, for legacy. But one truth cannot be ignored. These boys are no longer infants. They are young men with voices, with choices, and their words in this court carry weight." He nodded to the clerk, who handed him the transcript of Dmitry's and Alexei's earlier statements. He read them aloud, their words echoing again in the chamber. "We are not possessions. We are brothers. We will not be separated." The silence that followed was profound. Even the journalists scribbling notes slowed their pens. The judge set the paper down. "The court acknowledges the bond formed not by accident, but by choice. It is not the role of the law to sever what life itself has joined. Therefore, every breath in the room seems to halt. The court rules that custody will not be reassigned by blood alone. Dmitry Sergeyevich Volkov and Alexei Pavlovich Petrov will remain under joint guardianship of both families, with the right to maintain equal presence in each household. More importantly, they will be granted the freedom to determine, as they grow, where their hearts find home." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Marina half rose from her seat, her lips parting in disbelief. Anna sobbed openly, pressing her hands to her face. Sergei's jaw tightened, though for once he did not protest. Pavel exhaled a shuddering breath, his shoulders lowering as if he had been holding up the sky itself. The boys exchanged a glance, shocked, uncertain, but relieved. For the first time, the law had not spoken over them, but with them. The gavel struck once. "This case is closed." As the families filed out, the noise of the world rushed back, the flash of cameras, the murmur of reporters, the weight of countless eyes. But to Dmitry and Alexei, all of it faded. They walked together down the marble steps, side by side, their steps in rhythm. "Joint guardianship," Alexei muttered, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "Sounds like a mess." Dmitry allowed himself the faintest laugh. "Maybe. But at least we're not being torn apart." They paused at the bottom of the steps, the crowd pressing around them, and for a moment the future stretched wide and uncertain. But one truth was clear: whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together.